Okay. So these masters, of whom is led round the house, clothed in a royal garment, and him they call Zogones, extracted from Athenaeus. It's probably another Greek or Roman writer, probably Greek, having this name Athenaeus. Concerning the Tower of Babel and Abraham, the city of Babylon owes its foundation to those who were saved from the catastrophe of the flood. These were the giants, and they built the tower which is noticed in history. But the tower being overthrown by the interposition of God, or intervention of God, the giants were scattered over all the earth. This he is probably not Berossus, but the Greek author Eupolemus. Moreover, that in the 10th generation in the city of Babylonia, called Camarina, which by some is called the city Uri, and which signifies a city of the Chaldeans. There lived the 13th in descent, a man named Abraham, a man of a noble race and superior to all others in wisdom. Yeah, that's superior to all others in wisdom, not because he was a white man or whatever. Okay, no racial supremacy hinted there. Of him they relate that he was the inventor of astrology and the Chaldean magic, and that on account of his eminent piety he was esteemed by God. Talking to some native-born Assyrians, they despised these Chaldeans, these people that live in Chaldea, etc., etc., because they say, yeah, they are men who came in, they were wicked, and they did all this magic and all this sort of stuff, and it just caused problems to the Assyrian kingdom. Again, of him, Abraham, they relate that he was the inventor of astrology and the Chaldean magic, and that on account of his eminent piety he was esteemed by God, his righteousness, etc., his purity. It is further said that under the directions of God he removed and lived in Phoenicia, could that be Phoenicia, and there taught the Phoenicians, probably the Phoenicians, the motion of the sun and moon and all other things, for which reason he was held in great reverence by the king. Abimelech, king of Gerar, of Sardanapalus, Nabopolassar, whom Alexander Polyhistor calls Sardanapalus, sent to Astyages, the satrap of Media, and demanded his daughter Muites in marriage for his son Nebuchadnezzar. He was the commander of the army of Sarachus, king of the Chaldeans, and having been sent upon some expedition, turned his arms against Sarachus and marched against the city of Ninus, which is Nineveh. But Sarachus, confused by his approach, set fire to his palace and burnt himself in it. And Nabopolassar obtained the empire of the Chaldeans. He was the father of Nebuchadnezzar from the Chronicon of Eusebius. Okay, Amuetis means Amatus. Okay, so you have here the Sumerian text, 4000 to 2100 BC, Earth's oldest language, a word of cursing, he repeated, the locust charm, Earth's oldest text. At that time, Zeugadu was king, in humility, prostrating himself daily and perseveringly standing in attendance. A description of the Sumerian Noah, the first good man. That which midnight hath brought unto me, its meaning I understand not. King Guday's dream. Earth's oldest language. Introduction. Sumerian, as already explained, in the oldest of the four languages found among the ruins of the Euphrates Valley. So old is it that the earliest glimpse of history which we have rescued from oblivion, show us only the decay and downfall of the ancient Sumerian cities. These were spread along the banks of the lower Euphrates and the sea coast at its mouth. We find them fighting through the centuries in a valiant but gradually weakening struggle against the Akkadian people of the upper Euphrates. Among the last of the cities of the Sumerians to hold military power was Lagash, and their last great religious city was Nippur, the gods of which continued to be worshipped even by the Akkadians, long after all political supremacy had been lost to the Sumerians forever. The two cities of Lagash and Nippur have been carefully unearthed, and much of our knowledge of Sumerian comes from their rediscovered inscriptions. Even more of our present Sumerian knowledge is due to Ashurbanipal's great Assyrian library. Many texts have been found there written in the old Sumerian or religious language, just as our own printing presses all still occasionally issue Greek and Hebrew texts. In columns by the side of the Sumerian, the scribes of Ashurbanipal wrote its Assyrian translation. This interesting old scholar king, speaking of himself in one of his volumes, says, "Among the craftsmen I busied myself, the counsel and wisdom of the heavens with the wise masters I solved. I read the dreadful mysteries which should not be revealed, to translate into Akkadian the skillfully made tablets which were obscure. In Sumerian I was restless." The Sumerian of the later days is thus presented to us as a dead language, studied by the Babylonian and Assyrian priesthood. But when we unearth its remnants in Lagash and Nippur, we find its earlier and living form, in which both the writing and its meaning change, as all living languages change with the passing centuries. Languages evolve over time. The first inscription given in this section of our volume is among the oldest and probably the very oldest yet found. It was purchased from a modern Arab, and hence we do not know from what old Sumerian city it was unearthed, but its writing is of a very early type, a picture writing in which the pictures are still drawn with enough clearness to be recognized. So that's pictographs, right? In our volume we have throughout employed the chronology regarded as probable by our most recent authorities, and these have much reduced the reckoning of years which was accepted a decade ago. Yet even our latest scholars say of this tablet that it is about 6,000 years old, 4000 BC, and the reckoners of the last decade would unhesitatingly have added to this another 2,000 years. At this period, then, man makes his first appearance in surviving literature. How and upon what is he found employed at this, our earliest glimpse within his heart? What is his line of thought? What the level of his intellect in this opening record of his exceedingly busy and energetic career? We meet in this brief account two kinds of men, a group of farmers and a priest. The fields are affected by a plague of locusts, and their owners seek a priest or magician who drives the locusts away by a charm. It is a business transaction. Careful note is made of the number of fields cleared for each owner, and of the price to be paid. A curious price, a tall palm tree, yet in a way is it not as human as it is ancient? This medley of superstition and religion, of business and agriculture, which the plague, locusts and caterpillars behind. No names can be attached to this first record. The earliest name that looms up to us from the darkness is of later date. Our estimate says of about 3250 BC. It is the name of a victorious Akkadian king, Mesillium, who had so far conquered Sumer and had been so far conquered by its greater culture and religion that he sends a boastful offering to the temple of Lagash. It is a rather remarkable stone mace head of colossal size, far too large for human use, and apparently intended so that the god of the city, Ningusu, could employ it himself. The stone is carved with a circle of 6 lions, each attacking the one before him, and over them on the end of the mace is a carved eagle. The brief inscription runs, Mesillium, king of Kish, builder of the temple of Ningusu, deposited this masheed for Ningusu, while Lugal Shag Ingur was priest king of Lagash. Of course, this might mean merely that Mesillam had built in his own Akkadian city a temple to Ningusu and wished to proclaim this generosity at the god's chief shrine. A priest king, however, was frequently subordinate to some large ruler. In the probable case is that Mesillam held sway over Lagash and was engaged, as we shall find many a later Akkadian conqueror, in rebuilding the ancient temple, which either time or his own destructive assault had reduced to ruin. These Babylonian temples and towers were built of brick and were forever crumbling. Our second text is the first lengthy one surviving. It dates from about Mesillam's time, or perhaps from a generation later, when Lagash had again asserted its independence. Its king, Higal, is no longer a mere priest king. The text calls him a subduer, and the uniter of the land. It also speaks of his building or improving canals, so the land was already extensively farmed, scientifically irrigated. We note also that many ways of irrigation were used by oxen, by rain, etc., that grain had a royal standard of purity, that bronze was used for money, and so on. We have stumbled on a complex civilization. After this, the surviving records become more numerous. They are chiefly royal inscriptions from Lagash. King Nina, who ruled about 3000 BC, left several offerings to the god Ningusu. So did Kajina, who is perhaps the most interesting of these early rulers, for we find that he was a reformer, upraised apparently by a revolt of the poor. Following down the lines of the kings of Lagash, we come at last to Gudea, who, about 2500 BC, is content once more to call himself merely a priest king. The inscriptions of Gudea are the first to extend beyond the very barren outlines of his predecessors. There is a moral tone in all he says. His very noted inscriptions boast not only of conquering and building, but of dealing out justice, enforcing law, and sheltering the weak. Two of Gudea's prayers have also come down to us. They are parts of a remarkable narrative written down upon a clay cylinder, apparently by the king's own order. The tale is now known as Gudea's Dream, and is by far the most striking literary piece preserved from the old Sumerian. From it we can begin to form a clear conception of the religious thought of Babylonia. Next we come upon a still more important fragment, the oldest of the several Babylonian versions of the creation. We cannot date this exactly, but it is Sumerian, and while our present text comes from Nippur, the story is clearly the retelling of a much more ancient tale from a time when Lagash, Shuli, and Nippur perhaps were unknown. Neither of them is mentioned as one of the originally created cities, though the translator thinks Nippur must have been named in some lost fragment. The oldest place is given to Eridu, the ancient seacoast city of Berosus' legion of the fish god. As this old text is so important and also unfortunately so badly broken, reprint with it the explanation of its contents by its recent discoverer. Two other versions of the creation legend are also given, but these are Sumerian texts preserved from Ashurbanipal's library and may have been modified by later ideas. One of them, indeed, bodily substitutes Marduk, the great god of Babylon, for some earlier god as being the chief creator. Hence these texts do not hold the same positive antiquity as the preceding. The charms against evil spirits with which this section closes are also the transcribed Sumerians of a later age. The old charms were presumably kept in their Sumerian form, from a belief that the mere words themselves had a power over evil spirits, just as astrology still seeks in Hebrew or in Arabic the ineffable name and of magical command. Hence this section, which began with superstition, must also close with it. The venerable Sumerian tongue, after an active employment of uncounted thousands of years, faded in its final usage into a mere hocus pocus of enchantment. Earth's oldest language, the locust charm. The tablet records the means taken to rid various tracts of land of a plague of locusts and caterpillars. The last line, "he made it bright," refers to the ceremonial purification of the field. Okay, so that's the locust charm, Earth's oldest text, Sumerian words, translation. The Sumerian words are given here because their great antiquity leaves them a special interest. This and the following translation are reprinted by permission from the translation by Professor G. A. Barton in Volume 9 of the University of Pennsylvania, USA, Publications of the Babylonian section. Column 1. I began Higgin Misal Usumule, Bur of land belonging to the Kigmisal. At sunset, the locust he drove out, the curse he established, he removed the terror. Yeah, it's got it all here in the Sumerian. Okay. Columns 1, case 2 contains 2 new pictographs, the sun entering its subterranean passage and a locust. Columns 1, the edge presents a new and difficult sign. It is a kind of helmet with a cape at the back in the manner of a modern Arab kafiyeh. 2 signs were previously known which had descended from a somewhat similar headdress, though neither of them indicated so complex a picture. This translator has interpreted this new picture by one of these, or this author of this book, or whoever it's related to. Column 1.5 contains the most complete picture of a bird and egg yet found. The oldest form previously known lacked the bill of the bird, so graphically pictured there or here. The oldest writings in the world, the Sumerian stone tablet containing the locust charm. See the text over here. And this is what it looks like. And there's some more Sumerian words translated into English here. And some more information about the different pictures, figures, etc. There's plenty more inscriptions of Enki Hagar, king of Lagash, the Sumerian words in the translation, and it continues. The royal inscriptions of Lagash, inscriptions of King Urnina, number 1, column 1, etc. Translated in English by the look of it. This is quite extensive. Goes on about the god Enlil, so forth. Inscriptions of Gudea. It's quite an extensive explanation. The Dream of Gudea, column 1. The destruction of Uruk. The oldest creation story, with a preliminary explanation by Dr. Arno Poebel, or Poebel. Our text is a poem, as may be seen from the mere external appearance of the tablet, namely the arrangement of the lines in the frequent blank spaces between the various groups of signs due to the rhythmical character of the text. Readers of the Bible, moreover, will easily recognize the quaint principle of partial repetition or paraphrase in parallel lines, which is so characteristic a feature of Hebrew poetry. At the beginning of the preserved portion of the first column, we find the goddess Nintur, or Ninhasaga, speaking of the destruction of mankind, with which she calls hers because she was one of its creators, as we shall presently see. Isn't this the same as Anu, a later myth that knew of the gods destroying the created beings of whom she loved, or he loved, and gave a plan of how to build a boat or an ark to put all the people in, certain people in, to survive on. At the beginning of the preserved portion of the first column, we find the goddess Nintu, or Ninhasaga, speaking of the destruction of mankind, which she calls hers, because she was one of its creators, as we shall presently see. It is not clear, however, whether in this passage she promises to protect humankind from destruction, or whether she declares her intention to destroy humankind. The answer to this question would definitely establish the relation between the first two columns of our tablet, or of the tablet, and the rest of the text. The point at issue being whether the former present an independent account of the creation, or simply a retrospective description of the origin of what was to perish in the flood, namely all living beings and the cities which man had built. Unfortunately, it will be impossible to give a definite answer to this important question as long as the upper portion of the tablet is missing. Be this as it may, in line 11 we read that the creating deity fixes the commandments concerning man, i.e. defines his duties and his rights, one of which is, e.g., for example, the building of cities and temples in a clean spot, i.e. in hallowed places, or places made holy, considered holy. The last lines of the first column refer to the creation of the animals, which by this passage are shown to have been created after man, just as in the second biblical account of the creation in Genesis 2. The introductory lines 13 and 14, which form the translation from the account of the creation of man to that of the animals, fortunately gives us the names of the four creators of mankind, namely Anu, Enlil, Enki, and the goddess Ninhasaga, the four highest deities of the Babylonian pantheon. Remember that they had many gods, multiple gods. It has hitherto been almost completely overlooked what an important part of the last named deity played in the earlier Babylonian period, especially in the southern section of the country. Our passage therefore further furnishes us a most welcome clue concerning the position of this deity. One of the sacred cities of the Scottish, the city of Adab, has been made known to us by the excavations of the University of Chicago. In the preserved portion of the second column we read of 5 pre-Diluvian cities of Babylonia, which were founded and bestowed upon various deities, evidently by the most powerful of the gods, namely Enlil, the lord of all the lands. As the first of these cities, Eridu, is given to Enki, the lord of the ocean, who is the third of the gods in rank. It is possible that the now missing upper portion reported the founding of the sacred cities of the two highest gods, namely Uruk, the city of Anu, god of heaven, and Nippur, the city of Enlil himself, which has been partially excavated by the University of Pennsylvania, and where our own tablet was dug from the soil. In one of the two cities, moreover, one of the created men must have been established as the first king of Babylonia, but in our text we have preserved only an allusion to the creation of the insignia of this king in the broken lines at the beginning of column 2. The last lines of the column are not clear to me, to this author. Possibly they treat of the creation of canals, etc., the water of which was indispensable for the existence of the Babylonian cities, for without it the land would turn into a sandy desert, as indeed it has in many places at the present day. In the third column of our fragment we are already in the story of the flood. The gods have resolved to destroy mankind, but when it comes to the execution of the decision, the gods, and especially the goddess Inanna and Nintu, are filled with terror, and the latter with repentance for the great calamity which they have caused. But it is only Enki, the god of wisdom, who is able to devise a plan to save at least one of the doomed race, Seugidu, the 10th and last of the pre-Diluvian kings, who, like Noah in the Bible, was a pious man, religious, totally holy, righteous, etc. In column 4 we therefore read that Enki informs Seugidu of the resolution of the gods And the missing part of the same column must have reported how Ziugudu built his boat and placed it in his family and all kinds of artisans, as well as any sorts of animals. So it's saying he placed in that ark his family and all kinds of artisans, okay, as well as sorts of animals. In the fifth column, the deluge itself is recounted. It is caused only by a strong rain, or in the Babylonian expression, the rain demon, not as in the latter biblical account, also by the waters from underneath the earth. The duration of the rain is 7 days and 7 nights. In this, our tablet differs from the previously known Babylonian account, which gives it as 6 days only. Nevertheless, at this point, our text stands much nearer to this other Babylonian account than to either biblical tradition, the older of which makes the rain last 40 days and nights, while according to the later tradition, the flood continued to rise for 5 months. See the variation between these ancient mythical texts and the later biblical Hebrew, Jewish, etc. texts that we have today in our modern Bible versions, right? There's a great difference here. After the rain has ceased, the sun god appears from behind the clouds and is the first to observe Ziugudu in his boat, which is floating on the waters. Our hero prostrates himself before the god, and by offering up sacrifices evidently wins his favour. In the sixth and last column, after an obscure passage, he prostrates himself before Enlil, who had been chiefly responsible for the resolution of the gods to destroy mankind. But he, too, is now appeased and shows his favour by making Ziugudu a god. In the last of the preserved lines, the gods take Ziugudu to a distant land, probably the country of Dulmun, somewhere on the shore of the Persian Gulf, where he lives thenceforth as a god. Is that dropping a hint that he's Enoch? Doesn't really tell you there, but it sounds pretty familiar. He didn't die, he becomes a god, he doesn't die, and he gets taken by the gods to live as a god. Okay, so here's the columns and how it's translated into English. My humankind on its destruction I will, maybe this bit's missing, possibly I will should read in the plural let us. There's more there, more translated in English of the different columns. A later Sumerian creation text. The holy house, the house of the gods, and the holy place had not yet been made. No reed had sprung up, nor tree had been created, no brick had been laid, no building had been set up, no house had been erected, no city had been built, no city had been made, no creature had been created. Nippur had not been made, Ekur had not been built, Uruk had not been created, Iana had not been built, and so forth. All lands were sea. At that time there was a movement in the sea, and so forth. The city of Babylon was built, and Isagil was finished. The gods, the Anunnaki, i.e. Marduk, is what it says here down the bottom. Where are we? The gods, the Anunnaki, i.e. Marduk, he created at one time the holy city, the dwelling of their hearts' desire they proclaimed supreme. Marduk laid a reed upon the face of the waters. He formed dust and poured it out beside the reed, that he might cause the gods to dwell in the habitation of their heart's desire. He formed mankind. The goddess Aruru, together with him, created the seed of mankind. The Sumerian version reads, together with the god. The beasts of the field and living creatures in the field he formed. And this is from the a later Sumerian creation text, translated from the translation of L.H. King. The creation of the sun and moon, when the gods Anu, Enlil and Enki, through their sure counsel and by their great commands, ordained the renewal of the moon god, the reappearance of the moon in the creation of the month, and ordained the oracle of heaven and earth. The new moon did Anu cause to appear in the midst of heaven. He beheld it come forth. And it carries on. Version. It's got 7 indication there. Next one. When Anu, Bel, and Ea, the great gods, through their sure counsel, fixed the bounds of heaven and earth. And that footnote says the first 7 lines are in Sumerian. The last 7 purport to translate this into Assyrian, but as we will be seen, they vary considerably from the original. And 8. Mankind beheld the sun god in the gate of his going forth in the midst of heaven and earth. They duly created him. 8 and 9. It is interesting to note that in the Semitic version, the creation of the sun is substituted for that of the moon, although in the preceding line the renewal of the month is referred to. 9. The reverse of the tablet, which is badly preserved, is inscribed with some grammatical and astrological notes. And it has charms against evil spirits, tablet 1 to 5. Okay, and the rules behind it, the information behind it. And continues to tablet 9, 10, and then there's a hymn to the storm god Ishkar. The original of this hymn is in Sumerian, though possibly of late date. It is reprinted from Sumerian and Babylonian Psalms by S. Langdon, and so forth. Early text of Akkad, 3200 to 2100 BC. Sargon, the first world conqueror. The fruit of death may man meet, and yet the fruit of life may he achieve. Old Akkadian song. The early text of Akkad, introduction. Except for the religious songs or temple hymns, which the later Assyrian and Babylonian priests preserved in the ancient archaic form, our texts of the older Akkadian or of the days preceding Hammurapi are not numerous. Akkadian, as already explained, is a name given to the first known Semitic peoples who invaded the Euphrates Valley. So the Sumerians were not Semitic. Okay? The Akkadians and the Babylonians were, and then possibly the Assyrians. They were apparently a much less cultured people than the Sumerians and possessed no form of writing. Hence the invaders wrote their first inscriptions in the Sumerian tongue. Indeed, the oldest Akkadian text yet found is a fragment of a quaint temple record which opens with Sumerian words but occasionally drifts into the Akkadian with which the scribe was doubtless more familiar. It is given here that the reader may note how the Sumerian temple offerings of grain are changed to offerings of domestic animals, and how from bronze money men passed to the use of gold. The early Akkadians were nomads rather than agriculturists. They reckoned their wealth in flocks and herds. As the later generations became more settled, they built up an elaborate agricultural system. This is partly preserved in our second text, which is only a late Assyrian transcript, but must, from its obscurity, have been originally of early date. It supplies us with our earliest details of farming processes and of man-made laws. From the same source, an old Akkadian text preserved with a late Assyrian translation, comes our next text, a very ancient philosophy, a long-forgotten king's vague musings on the worth of kingship and of life. Following this, we give the genuine old Akkadian inscriptions, read from the statues and tablets of the ancient kings, the materials from which we have built up our knowledge of their reigns. From these we learn briefly that there was a conqueror, Lugal-Zagisi, who overthrew the great Sumerian city of Lagash, and who was at length overthrown in his turn by Sargon. One or the other of these vigorous fighters established dominion over all the river valley, became in fact sole ruler of the world known to him. Sargon, who at first inscribes himself only as king of Agade and as being subordinate to a king of Kish, comes finally to call himself sovereign of all lands and servant only to the gods. Thus we see his rise from ruler of one city to ruler of all Akkad and Sumer, and even of lands beyond. This Sargon may be the Sargon of later legend, or may be a still earlier king of similar name. The records of later Babylon refer to the origin of the mighty city to a king Sargon of Agade and tell a poetic legend of him. This, as well as the later Akkadian chronicles, which begin with Sargon, is given here so that readers may see how the writing of history was first practiced. The legend of Sargon's birth has aroused special interest because, as the reader will see, it bears some resemblance to the Bible story of Moses. They may have taken it from that original Sargon saga. Right? We also include in this section a recently discovered list of kings, such as Berossus must have had before him when he wrote of the tens of thousands of years that the Babylonian civilization had existed. And here's the early text of Akkad, fragments of a temple record, our earliest Akkadian text, column 1, column 2. Okay, it's in English, translated in English. Here's a footnote down the bottom here. This apparently means that the temple garden was ruined. The list is a sort of chronicle of the temple happenings of every sort. Okay, it's here. The swamp overflowed the Lord's domain. Together trees and corn died. So again, this apparently means that the temple garden was ruined, etc.